Somewhere in the Western Pacific, in the summer of 1944, a Japanese naval officer encountered something that stopped him cold. It was not an enemy warship. It was not a bomber. It was not a weapon of any kind. It was a barge, a concrete barge, sitting quietly in the lagoon of a tiny coral atoll the Japanese military command had barely noticed on a map. And inside that barge, inside this floating structure built not from precious war steel, but from concrete, the United States Navy was manufacturing ice cream. 500 gallons of ice cream per shift. At that exact moment, on a different island not far away, Japanese soldiers were dying. Not from bullets, from hunger. This is not a story about ice cream. This is a story about two civilizations fighting the same war from entirely different worlds. One world was running out of everything: rice, medicine, ammunition, hope. The other world had built a floating factory to make dessert, and it had deployed that factory to the front lines of the bloodiest naval war in human history. By the end of this video, I want you to understand something that most people who study World War II never fully grasp. The Pacific War was not decided at Midway. It was not decided at Guadalcanal. It was not decided at Lake Gulf. It was decided in the factories, the supply depots, the cargo holds, and yes, the ice cream machines of two nations that were not even remotely comparable in what they could produce, sustain, and deliver to the men fighting their wars. And there was one moment, one specific, almost absurd moment, where the reality of that divide became impossible to ignore. This is that story. To understand why the ice cream barge mattered, you first have to understand what the men of the Imperial Japanese military believed about the enemy they were fighting. And what they believed was this: America was soft. America was a nation of factory workers, businessmen, and immigrants. A country without the warrior spirit, the Bushido Code, the unshakable willingness to die for the emperor that defined the Japanese soldier. Japanese propaganda in the 1930s and early 1940s had painted the United States as a nation divided, decadent, and fundamentally unwilling to sustain the brutal losses that a real war, a total war, would demand. This was not irrational. It was, in fact, based on a genuine reading of American political history. After World War I, the United States had retreated into isolationism. The American public had spent the 1930s actively resisting involvement in European and Asian conflicts. There were legitimate reasons to believe that a nation this reluctant to fight would not have the stomach to fight very long. The Japanese military's strategic plan for the Pacific War was built on this assumption. It was called the Decisive Battle Doctrine. The idea was simple, if devastating in its ambition. Strike fast, strike hard, and seize enough territory in the first 6 months of the war to create a defensive perimeter so vast, so difficult to penetrate, that the cost of retaking it would be greater than any American political will could bear. The Americans, facing the prospect of a long and bloody island-hopping campaign across thousands of miles of open ocean, would negotiate a settlement. Japan would keep its gains. The Pacific would, effectively, become a Japanese lake. In the first 6 months of the war, this plan worked almost exactly as designed. Pearl Harbor, Wake Island, Guam, the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, Burma. By April 1942, Japan had conquered more territory in less time than any empire in modern history. The defensive perimeter existed. It stretched across 4,000 miles of ocean. And somewhere in Tokyo, in the planning rooms of the Imperial General Headquarters, military strategists looked at their maps and believed, genuinely believed, that they had won the strategic phase of the war before the Americans had even finished burying their dead at Pearl Harbor. There was one man, however, who was not celebrating: Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, commander of the combined fleet, the most celebrated naval strategist in Japanese history. Yamamoto had studied at Harvard. He had served as a naval attaché in Washington. He had driven through American cities, visited American factories, and watched American oil derricks pumping petroleum out of the Texas earth at a rate that defied comprehension for someone from a nation with no oil of its own. He had, in short, actually seen America, and he had told his superiors what he saw, as clearly and as plainly as he could. He said, in the first 6 to 12 months of a war with the United States and Great Britain, I will run wild and win victory upon victory. But then, if the war continues after that, I have no expectation of success. Nobody listened. Or rather, they heard the first part and chose not to hear the second. The Japanese Empire of 1941 was, in military terms, extraordinarily formidable. Its navy was among the finest in the world. Its pilots, the aviators of the carrier strike groups that had devastated Pearl Harbor, were, man for man, among the most skilled combat flyers on the planet. The Zero fighter aircraft was faster and more maneuverable than anything the Americans could put in the air in the early months of the war. The Japanese army had been hardened by years of combat in China. Its soldiers were disciplined, motivated, and willing to endure hardships that most Western military planners would have considered simply incompatible with sustained combat effectiveness. All of this was real, and almost none of it was sufficient, because underneath all of that military excellence, there was a problem that Yamamoto had seen and the rest of Japan's leadership had refused to see. Japan was an island nation with almost no domestic sources of the raw materials that modern industrial warfare required. No oil. Japan imported approximately 88% of its oil, almost entirely from the United States and the Dutch East Indies, before the war began. Limited steel. Japan's steel production capacity at its wartime peak was approximately 9.5 million tons per year. The United States in the same year produced approximately 80 million tons. No rubber, no bauxite for aluminum, no copper in sufficient quantities. The vast manufacturing infrastructure that modern warfare required, the conveyor belts, the machine tools, the assembly lines, was simply not there in the quantities needed to sustain the kind of war Japan was now committed to fighting. The plan, therefore, was never to outproduce the United States. The plan was to make the United States not want to fight. And to execute that plan, Japan needed to hold its defensive perimeter, which meant supplying the hundreds of island garrisons scattered across 4,000 miles of ocean, which meant keeping those supply lines open, which meant protecting the merchant shipping that carried everything, food, medicine, ammunition, fuel, replacement parts, to the soldiers manning those far-flung outposts. And this is where the plan began to die. Japan began the war with approximately 6 million gross tons of merchant shipping capacity. It sounds like a lot. It was not enough. The Japanese military required an estimated minimum of 3 million tons of shipping just to meet the basic import needs of the home islands: coal, food, industrial materials. The remaining shipping had to supply an empire stretching across Southeast Asia, the Central Pacific, and beyond. There was almost no margin for error, and the United States submarine fleet was not interested in giving Japan any margin at all. By the end of the war, American submarines had sunk approximately 1,150 Japanese merchant vessels, totaling roughly 4.8 million gross tons of shipping. The math was catastrophic. Japan had started the war with 6 million tons of merchant shipping. It lost nearly 5 million tons of that capacity to submarine attack alone, not counting losses to air attack, not counting ships damaged and out of service, not counting the growing shortage of experienced crews to man the ships that remained. And here is what that number means in human terms. When a supply ship was sunk, the soldiers waiting for it did not receive a replacement shipment. They received nothing, and then they waited. And then, if the next ship was also sunk, they waited again. And eventually they stopped waiting because they were too weak from hunger to stand. In August 1942, the United States Marines landed on Guadalcanal. They were there to stop the Japanese from completing an airfield that would threaten Allied supply lines to Australia. What followed was one of the most brutal 6-month campaigns in the history of modern warfare. And for the Japanese soldiers defending the island, it became something else entirely. They called it Gato. It translates roughly as Starvation Island. In the 6 months of the Guadalcanal campaign, the Japanese military lost approximately 5,000 soldiers killed in combat. It lost approximately 15,000 soldiers to starvation and disease. 3 times as many men died from hunger as from American bullets. Japanese supply runs to Guadalcanal, conducted mostly by destroyers at night, in operations that came to be called the Tokyo Express, were increasingly intercepted by American naval forces and air power. What food and ammunition did reach the island arrived in quantities entirely insufficient for the number of men who needed it. By late 1942, Japanese soldiers on Guadalcanal were surviving on handfuls of rice per day, then half handfuls. Then, in the final weeks before the evacuation, some soldiers were surviving on grass, snails, and whatever plant life they could find in the jungle. Let me give you a sense of what that means in caloric terms. The Imperial Japanese Army's wartime ration standard was designed to provide approximately 3,000 calories per day to a frontline soldier. This was already below the standard maintained by most Allied armies, but it was functional. A soldier receiving 3,000 calories could fight. By late 1942 on Guadalcanal, many soldiers were receiving an estimated 1,500 calories per day, or less. By the final weeks, some were receiving effectively nothing. A caloric intake of 856 calories is, for an adult male performing physical labor in tropical heat, a slow death sentence. It does not kill you immediately. It kills you over weeks. First your muscles weaken, then your immune system collapses. Then the diseases that a healthy body would shrug off, dysentery, malaria, beriberi, become fatal. And all of this suffering was the result not of poor fighting spirit, not of cowardice, not of tactical ineptitude. It was the result of an empire that had committed itself to holding a perimeter it did not have the logistical infrastructure to supply. Yamamoto had warned them. Nobody had listened. If Guadalcanal was a warning, the Philippines was the fulfillment of everything that warning had predicted. When American forces returned to the Philippines in October 1944, MacArthur's famous return, they were not fighting, in purely tactical terms, a weakened enemy. The Japanese military in the Philippines fought with extraordinary tenacity and discipline. Individual soldiers, units, commanders, they performed acts of exceptional military skill and personal courage throughout the campaign. And yet, of the approximately 498,000 Japanese soldiers who died in the Philippines campaign, an estimated 400,000, 80%, died not from combat, but from starvation and disease. 80%. 4 out of every 5 Japanese soldiers who died in the Philippines did not die in battle. They died in the jungle, cut off from supply lines that no longer existed, eating roots and bark and whatever they could find, while American submarines continued to do what American submarines had been doing since 1942, systematically dismantling the maritime infrastructure that connected Japan's empire to the men sent to defend it. When you understand this, when you hold this number in your mind, something else comes into focus. The war in the Pacific was not primarily won by American soldiers, Marines, and sailors being braver or more skilled than their Japanese counterparts. It was won by American submarines being more numerous, more technologically advanced, and more strategically deployed than Japan's anti-submarine warfare capabilities could neutralize. It was won by American industrial production being so overwhelming, so relentless, so incomprehensibly vast that it generated not just a fighting force, but an entire floating civilization capable of sustaining itself anywhere in the world's largest ocean. And nowhere was that civilization more vividly, more absurdly, more completely illustrated than in the thing I mentioned at the very beginning of this video. The ice cream barge. But before we get there, and we will get there, I promise, I want you to understand what that barge was responding to. Not just the military reality, but the human reality of what ice cream meant to a sailor in the Pacific War. Because this matters, this is not a frivolous detail. This is the heart of the story. While the Japanese supply system was collapsing under the weight of submarine interdiction and structural neglect, something extraordinary was happening in the United States. It is hard, from a modern vantage point, to fully convey the scale of American industrial mobilization during World War II. We have numbers, we can quote them, but numbers alone do not capture what it actually looked like. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States produced 86,000 tanks, 286,000 aircraft, including B-29 Superfortresses, P-51 Mustangs, Hellcat fighters, and the bombers that would eventually deliver the atomic bombs over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. 8,800 naval vessels, including aircraft carriers, battleships, destroyers, cruisers, submarines, landing craft, and the support ships that kept the entire fleet operational. And 2,710 Liberty ships. Liberty ships, the mass-produced cargo vessels that kept Allied supply lines alive across both the Atlantic and the Pacific, were built using standardized, prefabricated components. Shipyards could assemble them at a rate that observers at the time described as almost physically impossible to believe. During a 1942 publicity stunt, the Robert E. Peary was constructed, launched, and made ready for sea in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. Japan's shipyards were building ships one at a time by hand, with craftsmen who had to machine custom-fitted components for each vessel. The United States was stamping them out like automobiles. This is not a small logistical difference. It is the difference between a craftsman making a pair of shoes and a factory producing 10,000 pairs of shoes a day. And it is in that gap, that almost incomprehensible gap in industrial philosophy, that the ice cream barge was born. Here is something I want you to consider for a moment. The United States Navy in 1914 had banned alcohol from all naval vessels. Secretary of the Navy Josephus Daniels, in a move that was deeply controversial at the time, issued General Order No. 99, prohibiting the consumption or possession of alcohol aboard any U.S. Navy ship. For sailors who spent months, sometimes years, at sea in conditions of extreme danger, monotony, and stress, this was not a trivial deprivation. Alcohol in the naval culture of virtually every major power in the world was a fundamental part of life at sea. It dulled the edges, it marked occasions, it provided comfort in a profession that offered very little of it. The U.S. Navy needed a replacement, and slowly, over the years between 1914 and 1941, that replacement was found. Ice cream in the U.S. Navy of the World War II era occupied a cultural role that is genuinely difficult to overstate to a modern audience. It was not just a dessert, it was a morale instrument. It was a psychological anchor to civilian life. A taste of the home, the neighborhood, the diner, the Sunday afternoon that every man aboard every ship had left behind when they enlisted. The Navy understood this, and the Navy, being the Navy, decided to approach it with industrial seriousness. In September 1944, a force of U.S. Marines and Navy personnel quietly occupied a tiny coral atoll in the Caroline Islands. The atoll was called Ulithi. Most people today have never heard of it. Most people in 1944 had never heard of it either. The Japanese military, in its defense planning, had largely overlooked it. It had no strategic resources, no significant population, no facilities worth defending. It was just a ring of coral islands surrounding a lagoon. What it had was the lagoon. And the lagoon, approximately 200 square miles of calm, deep, sheltered water, located nearly 1,000 miles east of the Philippines, turned out to be one of the most strategically valuable pieces of geography in the Pacific Ocean. Within weeks of its seizure, U.S. Navy Seabees, the Naval Construction Battalions whose motto was, "We build, we fight," had transformed Ulithi into something the world had never seen before. Airstrips appeared on the coral islands surrounding the lagoon. Piers were driven into the shallow water. Fuel depots were established. A submarine base was constructed. A hospital complex was built on Pitialu Island. A recreation facility, a beach with cold beer and the occasional improvised baseball diamond, was built on the islet of Mogmog. And anchored in the lagoon itself, growing in size week by week as new ships arrived from Hawaii, California, and the shipyards of the American East Coast, was what became known as Service Squadron 10. This was not a fighting force. Service Squadron 10 was the logistical backbone of the entire U.S. Pacific Fleet, a mobile fleet of oilers, repair ships, refrigerated cargo vessels, ammunition ships, and support vessels that could keep the warships of the 3rd and 5th Fleets operational indefinitely, without ever needing to return to Pearl Harbor or the continental United States. Damaged ships came to Ulithi and left repaired. Empty fuel tanks came in and left full. Ammunition magazines came in depleted and left restocked. Exhausted crews came in and received mail from home, fresh food, movies, and, where the support ships had the equipment, ice cream. By late March 1945, at the peak of its operation, Ulithi hosted over 700 ships in a single lagoon. 700 ships in one lagoon, including the massed carriers of Task Force 58, the murderer's row of Essex-class carriers that U.S. Navy photographers captured in iconic aerial photographs, their flight decks stretching as far as the eye could see, all of them anchored in neat lines in a body of water that the Japanese military had dismissed as worthless. It is one of the most extraordinary photographs of the entire war. Look at it carefully. Every one of those carriers represents 3,000 men, dozens of aircraft, months of preparation, years of industrial investment. And behind each carrier, behind the fighting ships, were the support vessels, the oilers, the ammunition ships, the repair barges, the hospital ships, and anchored somewhere in that lagoon, doing something that no military in the history of the world had ever done before, the ice cream barges. Their official U.S. Navy designation was BRL, Barge, Refrigerated Large. 3 were built. They were named with the deadpan practicality that the U.S. military brought to most things: USS Hydrogen, USS Calcium, and USS Antimony. They were not glamorous. They were not fast. They had no engines of their own. They had to be towed by tugboats from anchorage to anchorage throughout the Western Pacific. And they were constructed not from the high-grade steel that was being poured into carriers, destroyers, and tanks, but from reinforced concrete, because steel was too precious to spare for a barge whose primary job was to make ice cream. Each barge cost approximately $1 million to build. That is approximately $18 million in today's money. The U.S. Navy spent $18 million in today's terms building 3 concrete barges whose function was, in part, to manufacture frozen dessert in a war zone. Let me give you the production specifications. Each barge could produce 10 gallons of ice cream every 7 minutes. That works out to approximately 500 gallons per shift. Each barge could store approximately 2,000 gallons of finished product at any given time. Beyond the ice cream, each barge also carried 1,500 tons of frozen meat and 500 tons of fresh produce and dairy to support fleet operations. This made them critical logistical assets beyond their famous secondary function. They were, in essence, floating cold storage warehouses that kept the entire Pacific Fleet fed. But it is the ice cream number that matters here: 500 gallons of ice cream per shift. While the U.S. Navy was producing 500 gallons of ice cream per shift in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, Japanese soldiers on those same Pacific islands were dying of starvation. 3,000 miles in one direction. A sailor getting a scoop of chocolate ice cream on the fantail of a destroyer, reading a letter from his wife in Ohio. 3,000 miles in the other direction. A Japanese corporal in a foxhole in New Guinea, eating grass and fighting off Beriberi with his bare will to survive. The same war, the same ocean, the same year, two entirely different universes. Here is a detail that I find, in a strange way, the most revealing single fact about American logistical culture during World War II. Ice cream in the Pacific Fleet was a form of currency. When U.S. aircraft went down at sea, when pilots ditched into the ocean after combat or mechanical failure, the standard search and rescue protocol involved smaller ships like destroyers and destroyer escorts, which had the range and maneuverability to reach downed aviators. But the pilots they were rescuing belonged to the aircraft carriers, and the aircraft carriers had ice cream machines. The destroyers often did not. And so an informal, utterly unofficial, completely unsanctioned, absolutely real practice emerged. Small ships that rescued carrier aviators would sometimes negotiate with the carriers before handing the pilots back. The carrier, grateful for the return of a trained and experienced pilot, would reciprocate with what the destroyer crewmen actually wanted. Gallons of ice cream, pilots for ice cream. This was not a joke. It was not propaganda. It was a documented phenomenon, the kind of informal economy that emerges when one commodity becomes sufficiently scarce relative to another. Think about what this tells you. A navy that has so much institutional capacity to produce and distribute ice cream that it can use it as an informal bargaining chip in the middle of a war, is a navy operating from a logistical platform that is categorically different from any military that has ever come before it. It is not just better supplied, it is operating in a different dimension of material reality. Before we get to the Japanese reaction to all of this, I want to tell you about a single moment that I think encapsulates the entire human dimension of what ice cream meant to the men of the U.S. Navy. May 8, 1942. The Coral Sea. The USS Lexington, CV-2, Lady Lex, one of the first and most beloved aircraft carriers in the U.S. Navy, had just been mortally wounded. Japanese torpedoes and bombs had started fires that the crew, fighting desperately and skillfully, could not fully control. Below decks, aviation fuel vapors ignited. The resulting explosions made it clear that the ship could not be saved. Captain Frederick Sherman gave the order to abandon ship. The Lexington's sailors, 2,735 of them, began the organized, disciplined process of evacuation. Life rafts went into the water. Men descended lines. The destroyers standing by came in close to pick up survivors. And somewhere below decks in the ship's service area, the jedunk stand where sailors bought snacks, candy, and ice cream between duty watches, a group of sailors made a decision. The ice cream was going to be lost anyway. The ship was going to the bottom. So they stopped, and they ate the ice cream. Multiple survivor accounts, collected by oral historians in the years after the war, describe men standing in the jedunk area of a burning aircraft carrier, scooping ice cream into their helmets and eating it quietly while the ship burned around them and their shipmates prepared to leap into the Pacific. Some accounts describe the men eating in near silence. Some describe laughter. Some describe what can only be called a strange, surreal peace. The peace of men who had done everything they could, who had nothing left to do but wait for the ship to tell them it was time to go. Now, I want you to hold that image in your mind. Sailors on a burning carrier, eating ice cream from their helmets. And I want you to hold, alongside it, a different image. Japanese soldiers on Guadalcanal in November 1942, eating grass. Both images are real. Both happened. Both represent the lived experience of men fighting the same war in the same ocean. But only one of those images was possible because of what was happening thousands of miles behind the front line. In the shipyards, the factories, the cold storage depots, and the refrigerated concrete barges of the United States of America. The question I want to address now is this: when did Japanese military and political leadership truly understand what they were up against? Not intellectually, not statistically, but viscerally in their bones, in the way that only happens when you see something with your own eyes and can no longer dismiss it as exaggeration or allied propaganda. The answer, it turns out, is layered, and it comes from multiple directions simultaneously. The first layer is Yamamoto himself. We have already established that Yamamoto knew. He had seen America. He had warned Japan's leadership. His famous statement, made before the war began, was not a performance. It was the assessment of a man who had personally driven through the American Midwest and understood, at a gut level, that a nation capable of producing what he had seen could not be defeated in a war of attrition. Yamamoto's prediction was almost supernaturally precise. The Battle of Midway, the decisive turning point that shattered Japan's offensive carrier capability, occurred on June 4 to 7, 1942. Pearl Harbor had been attacked on December 7, 1941. The interval between those two dates was almost exactly 6 months, precisely the window Yamamoto had named. He had run wild. He had won victories. And then, as he had predicted, it had begun to turn. Yamamoto died on April 18, 1943, when American P-38s, guided by decoded Japanese communications, intercepted his transport aircraft over Bougainville. He never saw the full extent of what he had predicted come to pass, but he had told them. He had told them as clearly as any man could tell them anything. Now the second layer. The second layer is what the Japanese naval and military intelligence services were able to observe and document as the war progressed. Japanese reconnaissance flights, submarine patrols, and coastwatcher networks gradually assembled a picture of what the United States was building in the Pacific. Reports filtered back to Tokyo and to fleet commands about the scale of the American naval presence at bases like Majuro and Niwatak, and by late 1944, Ulithi. These reports were, in some ways, almost incomprehensible to their recipients. The American fleet at Ulithi in late 1944 and early 1945 was not merely larger than the Japanese combined fleet. It was operating from a logistical base that the Japanese simply had no equivalent of. Nothing in their planning, their doctrine, or their industrial capacity had prepared them to counter. Service Squadron 10 could repair a damaged aircraft carrier in a fraction of the time that a conventional port facility would require. The floating dry docks at the forward bases could lift a ship bodily out of the water and repair its hull. The ammunition ships could restock a task force in hours rather than the days or weeks that returning to Pearl Harbor would require. And the intelligence that Japanese planners received describing this capability was, by multiple historical accounts, often disbelieved. Not because the intelligence was wrong, but because the reality it described was so far outside the frame of what the Japanese military-industrial system could comprehend as possible that accepting it felt like accepting a fantasy. There is a third layer to this story, and it is, in some ways, the most human. During the course of the Pacific War, a relatively small number of Japanese military personnel were taken prisoner by American forces. For the Imperial Japanese military, surrender was a cultural catastrophe. The Bushido Code that governed military ethics held death to be preferable to capture, and many Japanese soldiers killed themselves rather than allow capture. But some were taken, wounded and unconscious. Some surrendered when starvation had reduced them to near death. And some, as the war progressed and defeat became increasingly certain, simply stopped fighting. These prisoners, a small fraction of the total military force but significant in their testimony, went through something that German POWs in the European theater also experienced, though from a different starting point. They saw America. They saw what the American military actually looked like from the inside. The accounts that survive from Japanese prisoners of war in American custody describe a consistent pattern of adjustment and disorientation. The food alone was shocking. Not just the quantity, though the quantity was genuinely startling compared to what many prisoners had been surviving on, but the variety. American military rations, for all the complaints that American soldiers leveled at C rations and K rations, included meat, vegetables, coffee, chocolate, and cigarettes. They were designed by nutritional scientists to provide between 3,000 and 3,600 calories per day. This was for a prisoner who had been surviving on 856 calories of grass and rice, not just adequate. It was abundance beyond imagining. And it was not just the food. It was everything. The medical care, the communication infrastructure. Prisoners could sometimes receive and send letters. The recreational facilities at larger camps. The industrial routine of American life, visible in the farms, factories, and highway systems that prisoners encountered when they were transported across the United States. One of the most striking recurring observations in prisoner accounts, and in the later testimony of captured Japanese officers who were debriefed after the war, was the simple, bewildering reality of American material abundance. Not abundance as a wartime luxury, abundance as normalcy. The United States was not, in 1944, a nation that was sacrificing its civilian standard of living to sustain its war effort in the way that Japan was, or Germany was, or the Soviet Union was. Rationing existed, shortages of specific goods existed, civilians experienced genuine constraints, but the fundamental infrastructure of American life, its farms, its factories, its transportation networks, its commercial economy, continued to function at a level of productivity that represented a categorically different level of development than anything the Axis powers could match. American workers were building B-24 bombers, one every 63 minutes, while also eating, sleeping in houses with running water, and driving cars to factories that produced everything from tanks to lipstick. Now I want to bring it back to the barge. Because the BRL-class refrigerated concrete barges are not important because ice cream is important. They are important because of what they represent. They represent a nation that was fighting a total war. A war that consumed the entire economies, populations, and resources of the nations involved, and still had the industrial capacity, the logistical sophistication, the organizational discipline, and the sheer surplus production to build and deploy a $1 million concrete barge, whose purpose was to manufacture frozen dessert and deliver it to sailors in the most remote theater of the war. The ice cream barge was not a frivolity. It was a symptom of an economy so productive, a supply chain so comprehensive, a logistical system so well designed that after building the aircraft carriers, the destroyers, the submarines, the landing craft, the Liberty ships, the B-29s, the tanks, the trucks, the ammunition, the aviation fuel, the medical supplies, the parachutes, the boots, the radios, and the 10,000 other components that a functioning modern military requires. After all of that, there was still enough capacity left over to build a concrete barge and fill it with ice cream. Think about that. Think about what it would require for a nation at war to have industrial capacity left over. Japan had no capacity left over. Japan was struggling to allocate the steel, the aluminum, the oil, and the trained technical labor required to maintain its fighting forces in the field. Its aircraft industry could not replace pilots fast enough. Its shipyards could not replace carriers fast enough. Its army could not replace the soldiers dying of starvation on islands that could not be supplied fast enough. And the United States, simultaneously in the same war, in the same ocean, was building concrete barges to make ice cream. When Japanese intelligence reports described Ulithi and the fleet assembled there, they described a base that had its own hospital, its own airstrips, its own recreation island with a beach and beer and baseball. and its own refrigerated barges producing dairy products for sailors who had already been at sea for months. There is no single document I can point to, no single decoded message, no single prisoner diary that captures the exact moment a Japanese commander looked at this intelligence and said plainly, "We cannot win." But the broader documented reality is unmistakable. By 1945, Imperial Japan was a nation that was rationing food for its civilian population. A nation where schoolchildren were being organized into home defense units and issued bamboo spears to fight an anticipated American invasion. A nation where the military was planning a campaign called Ketsugo, Decisive Operation, a plan to repel the American invasion of the home islands that military planners privately admitted could cost millions of Japanese lives and still not succeed. And on the other side of that same ocean, the United States Navy was still manufacturing ice cream, 500 gallons per shift, in 3 concrete barges, at a base that the Japanese military had not even thought worth defending. I want to be careful here, and I want to be honest. It would be easy, and it would be wrong, to take this story and use it to reduce the Pacific War to a simple narrative of American abundance versus Japanese poverty. That framing, while partially true, misses something important. The Japanese military in World War II was not defeated because its soldiers were less brave, less skilled, or less committed than their American counterparts. The documented evidence of Japanese military performance throughout the war, at Guadalcanal, at Iwo Jima, at Okinawa, speaks clearly and tragically to a force of extraordinary courage and fighting effectiveness, even in the face of catastrophic material disadvantage. Individual Japanese soldiers, sailors, and aviators performed acts of valor and tactical brilliance throughout the conflict. And the Japanese defeat, while structurally inevitable given the logistical realities I have described, was not inevitable in every individual engagement. It was a strategic certainty that played out through thousands of tactical uncertainties. What the ice cream barge tells us is not that Americans were better soldiers. It tells us something more uncomfortable and more important. It tells us that logistics is not a support function. Logistics is the war. The side that can feed its men, supply its weapons, repair its ships, replace its losses, and yes, occasionally give its sailors ice cream is not just the side that is more comfortable. It is the side that has built a war-fighting system capable of sustaining itself indefinitely. The Japanese military designed a war that required a short American attention span. It built a fighting force that was optimized for the first 6 months of a conflict, and it planned on an opponent that would negotiate rather than sustain a long campaign. None of those assumptions held. The American public after Pearl Harbor was not demoralized. It was furious. And a furious, fully mobilized American industrial economy is one of the most powerful forces the modern world has ever produced. Between 1941 and 1945, the U.S. economy grew by approximately 73%, even accounting for the massive resources diverted to war production. While Japan's soldiers were dying of starvation, American factories were generating more productive capacity with each passing year. That gap never closed, it only widened. And the ice cream barge, absurd, concrete, $1 million, 500 gallons per shift, is the most vivid single image I know of for illustrating why. Now, and I want to be fair to this, there is a legitimate historical argument that Japan's logistical failure was at least partially a self-inflicted wound, not just a result of being outproduced. The Imperial Japanese military maintained a profound structural dysfunction between its army and navy. The IJA and IJN operated essentially as separate, competing organizations with their own supply chains, their own planning processes, and, frequently, their own strategic priorities that were in direct conflict. This meant that the Army did not reliably protect the Navy's supply ships. The Navy did not reliably prioritize the Army's supply needs. Inter-service rivalry cost Japan countless soldiers who starved to death, while food and medicine sat in warehouses or aboard ships that had been assigned to a different service's operational priorities. Germany, for all its industrial inferiority to the Allies, managed a more coordinated supply system. Japan, despite its formidable fighting capability, often could not coordinate between its two primary services well enough to feed its own men. This is worth knowing. It is a reminder that the outcome of the Pacific War was not purely a function of American industrial supremacy, as overwhelming as that supremacy was. It was also a function of Japanese institutional failures that, in a more effectively organized military, might have been at least partially mitigated. But only partially, because even a perfectly organized Japanese military, even a Japan where the Army and Navy cooperated seamlessly, where convoy protection was prioritized from day one, where the merchant fleet was defended as the lifeline it was, even that Japan could not have built what the United States built at Ulithi, could not have produced 500 gallons of ice cream per shift, could not have had anything left over. Japan was not defeated by its institutional failures alone. It was defeated by the arithmetic of an industrial war waged against the world's largest economy. The ice cream was just the most vivid measurement of the distance between the two sides of that equation. The three refrigerated concrete barges, USS Hydrogen, USS Calcium, and USS Antimony, survived the war. They were not glamorous vessels. They had no combat record. They received no battle stars. They were, in the naval accounting of heroism and sacrifice, invisible. But the men who served aboard the ships they supplied, the sailors who stood in mess lines at Ulithi and Eniwetok and the various advance bases of the Pacific Fleet, who received their rations and their mail and their cold scoop of vanilla on a tin tray, those men remembered the ice cream. In the oral histories collected by institutions like the National World War II Museum, sailors who served in the Pacific Theater return again and again to food as a marker of time, of morale, of connection to home. The mail, the food, the small normalcies in the middle of an abnormal existence. Ice cream was part of that, not because it was strategically decisive, not because a scoop of chocolate soft serve won any battle or changed any tide of war, but because it was a choice, a deliberate, considered, expensive choice by a military institution to say to its sailors, "We see you. We know what you've left behind. We know what you're enduring. And where we possibly can, where our industrial capacity makes it remotely feasible, we are going to give you something that reminds you that the world you're fighting for still exists." The Japanese military, facing its own soldiers dying of starvation, did not have that capacity. It did not have the ships to deliver rice, let alone luxuries. It did not have the surplus to spare. And the distance between a nation that could spare enough to build an ice cream barge and a nation that could not spare enough to feed its soldiers rice is the distance that explains, as much as any single fact can explain, why the Pacific War ended the way it did. On September 2, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri, anchored in Tokyo Bay, representatives of the Japanese Empire signed the instrument of surrender. The ceremony was brief, formal, photographed from every angle, and somewhere at a forward base in the Western Pacific, a concrete barge was producing ice cream, 500 gallons per shift, as it had been doing more or less continuously since 1944, because the war was over. But the machinery of American logistics, the machinery that had won it, did not simply stop. It had been built to last. The story of the ice cream barge is, in one way, a small story. 3 concrete barges, ice cream, a lagoon in the Western Pacific that most people have never heard of. But in another way, it is one of the most complete and honest summaries of World War II that I know of. 2 nations went to war. One of them understood what a modern industrial war required. Not just weapons, not just courage, not just strategy, but the entire industrial and logistical infrastructure to sustain a fighting force indefinitely, anywhere in the world, for as long as the mission demanded. One of them built that infrastructure, and the other one, brave, skilled, committed as it was, ran out of rice. The ice cream barge is not a joke. It is not American arrogance. It is not triumphalism. It is an engineering statement. It says we have solved logistics. We have solved supply. We have solved the problem of keeping men fed and motivated and connected to what they are fighting for, in the middle of the world's largest ocean, in the middle of the most destructive war in human history. And if you can say that, if you can actually build what it takes to say that, then the ice cream is almost an afterthought. Almost. If this story changed how you think about the Pacific War, or about what it actually takes to win a modern conflict, there's another story that connects directly to this one. The story of the engineers who built the floating bases, the dry docks that appeared from nowhere, the airfields carved out of coral atolls in days. The men who built the platform that made the ice cream barge possible. That story is coming. Don't miss it.